Name of person, Mrs. Tessa. Mrs. Psychic's name, Mr. Corey. Tessa's husband's name. 2. The name of Tessa's close disciple, Mrs. Moy, Mrs. Anna. Name of the woman who came to see the fortune teller. Psychic, fortune teller, Salem. Doi place name, Cambodia, where James went to work after Tessa went crazy again. Google, referred to as a search engine. YouTube, the video platform where the Our channel operates. Title, focuses on horror and thriller elements. Haunted in the Mirror, Ghost of Vengeance, The Ghost Bound, The Horrifying Secret After Death, The Curse of the Dead, Relentless Vengeance. Ghost Pursuit, Nights of Haunting Horror, Our Haunted Canal, Endless Horror. Title evokes curiosity and mystery. Secrets After Death, The Horrifying Hidden Truth, Mysterious Curse, Who Will Pay the Price? Ghost Returns, What Awaits? The Haunted House, Forgotten Horror Past, The Restless Souls, What Do They Want? Our channel episode, Wonder 29, The Grave of the Middle One, A Horrible Ghost Story, Missy David, Full 4K, YouTube, https www.youtube.com, watch V6NWS3VOGL4. Transcript, welcome to our channel, a place for horror spiritual ghost stories. If this is your first time visiting, hello, I am David, the owner of this place. Nice to see you again on our channel. Today's story will tell about the life of a famous psychic lady in Salem. Who is she? What will happen? Please follow along right away. Mr. Tar's family has lived on this land for generations. Next door to his house is Mrs. Tessa's house. In the past, the two families lived together in harmony, helping each other with any work or task without thinking twice. However, that peace did not last long. Everything changed completely when Mrs. Tessa went from being an ordinary person to becoming the most famous shaman in Salem after just one rainy day. When talking about Tessa's life, we are talking about an anecdote closely related to spirituality. When she was young, Tessa was very beautiful. She had a well-proportioned figure, neither tall nor short, with beautiful features. If you just looked at her, many people would think she was from a noble family. That's why all the men in the village were crazy about her. Some planted trees in front of her house for 3 years, and some argued with their parents to marry her. But God never gives anyone everything. When she was over 20 years old, Tessa suddenly went crazy. The image of a girl with a beautiful face but disheveled clothes, messy hair, and a mouth that kept muttering strange words was deeply imprinted in the minds of the people of Salem. Mr. Ty was young at that time, and when he saw Tessa half crazy and half terrible, he also avoided her. He thought that Tessa's life was hopeless. But that year, a shocking event happened. That year, the weather in Salem was terribly hot. The scorching sun lasted for months. The sky was already dark. The rice in the fields were all dry from lack of water. The ground was cracked and deep. Everyone was waiting for a rain to save the drought. The winding roads in the countryside were deserted, with not a single person passing by, except for a crazy girl named Tessa. As she walked, Tessa kept muttering a series of incomprehensible words, sometimes laughing, sometimes sobbing. There were days when people heard Tessa screaming, "Long live Vietnam! Long live Vietnam!" Many people saw it and felt sorry, but could not help. If Tessa still had her parents and siblings, her life would be somewhat less miserable. But Tessa was an only child. During those crazy years, Tessa's parents passed away, one after another. One day, Tessa wandered around again. The hot weather made the crazy girl feel uncomfortable. Tessa squatted, pressed her silly, lifeless face against the roadside flower, and whispered to the flower, "It's so hot. It's raining today. Listen to the rain. It's so hot." The words coming out of the crazy person's mouth seemed meaningless, but unexpectedly, they quickly became true. Just 5 minutes after Tessa's words, dark clouds gathered in the sky. The wind also blew continuously, carrying a pile of dry leaves flying all over the sky. "It's going to rain," The villagers all cried out in joy. Finally, that day it rained heavily. Thunder rumbled continuously, making their ears ring. At that time, Mr. Tai was still a young man. He had never witnessed such a severe drought, nor had he seen a rain as heavy as the rain that year. Suddenly someone shouted, "Oh my God! Someone run out and pull Tessa in. If she stays like that, lightning will strike her to death." Looking outside, it was dark, and Tessa was seen happily walking in the field, her whole body soaked in the rain. At this moment, lightning from the sky struck the ground continuously, burning down several large trees. Running out into the field now would be like walking into death, so no one dared to go out. Tessa was still happily walking in the field. Every time lightning struck, she would hold her head and lie down. Then she would stand up and hop around, looking very happy. And then a big bolt of lightning flashed in the sky, hitting Tessa straight on the ground, causing her to fall to the ground like a chopped banana tree. Another scream was heard. Oh my God! Tessa was struck to death by lightning. At that time, it was thought that Tessa would burn to death, freed from her life as a madwoman. But unexpectedly, Tessa survived. Even more surprisingly, Tessa became completely sane from then on, no longer as crazy as before. Red flower-shaped marks appeared on Tessa's body, initially only on her back, then spread all over her body and left marks on her face. Not only that, the pupils of Tessa's eyes also gradually turned a special yellow color. At the same time, Tessa suddenly had the ability to tell fortunes and summon the souls of the dead. The villagers kept gossiping that Tessa was the child of God, the child of Buddha. A few years after being struck by lightning, Mrs. Tessa married Mr. Corey, a man from a neighboring village. Mrs. Tessa and her husband began their spiritual activities. Countless people wanted to become her disciples. Countless people came to ask her to summon the souls of the dead. Her house had to receive hundreds of people a day. Every day, starting at 4 a.m., people came in line early to wait for their turn. No one knew how she performed her fortune-telling and summoning, but many confirmed that her predictions were accurate. Many elders in the village also respectfully called Mrs. Tessa teacher, called themselves their children, and said yes, 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 as if they were their own children and grandchildren. It had been 8 years since Tessa had been in charge of the teacher, and those 8 years were also the time when Mr. Tai hated Tessa so much. The reason why Mr. Tai hated Tessa was known to everyone in the village. Because he was an atheist, he did not believe in spirituality. The things that Tessa was doing to him were all superstitious nonsense. Mr. Tai thought that Tessa was the kind of person who robbed the common people with their saliva. He hated Tessa, and he also hated those who came to sell gods and saints. Sometimes he would carry a loudspeaker up to the roof and blare loudly to drown out the nonsense chanting of the next-door neighbor. And of course, Tessa did not like Mr. Tai either. Every time she went out, she avoided Mr. Tai. Every time she stepped out of the door and met Mr. Tai, she would not want to greet anyone, just stay in the house chanting Buddhist scriptures. Until one day, Mr. Tai suddenly had an unbearable headache, so he decided to go get some herbal medicine. Mr. Tai had just driven his motorbike out of the house when he met Mrs. Tessa. Seeing Mr. Tai, Mrs. Tessa suddenly frowned and greeted him first. But Mr. Tai did not like Mrs. Tessa. He raised his voice sarcastically. Damn, who let the teacher greet him first like this? Knowing that Mr. Tai did not have any good intentions, Mrs. Tessa did not argue. She only said, "Don't go out today, or you will get into trouble. If you stay at home, you might avoid trouble. Your forehead is very dark. I'm afraid there is less good than bad." Not letting Mrs. Tessa finish her sentence, Mr. Tai snapped in annoyance and said, "Hey, are you trying to curse me to death? You're talking nonsense, you better watch out." Having said that, Mr. Tai quickly drove away. Mrs. Tessa squinted at the regretful expression and shook her head with a sigh. After that, no one knows what happened, but Mr. Tai left the house at 7 a.m. and returned at 7 p.m. with a stiff body covered in mud. People had to massage his muscles and joints with alcohol for a long time before they could soften them. Mr. Ty's wife cried and fainted on the floor. According to people, Mr. Ty was driving when he suddenly had a stroke, lost control of the car, and plunged into the field. Mr. Ty died right there. Mr. Ty's funeral was held quickly, and of course Mrs. Tessa was the one to take care of the ceremony because they had been neighbors for decades. Since hearing the news that Mr. Ty died because he refused to listen to Ms. Tessa's prediction, Tessa admired his unique talent even more. In the past, people only called Ms. Tessa a teacher, but now they worshipped her as a saint. The number of people coming to see her increased, and she could not handle it all by herself. One day, Mrs. Tessa sat in front of the altar, sorting out the gold coins of the underworld. Suddenly, she sighed deeply. James, one of her closest disciples, asked, "Oh, are you unhappy? Why are you sighing so much today?" Hearing James's question, Mrs. Tessa looked up and replied, "I'm very worried. I go around telling fortunes and calling people's souls, but I don't get much money. You see, each time I only charge a few tens of thousands of silver. This house has been like this for years. It's still dilapidated and shabby. To tell you the truth, I don't have any money left to save. And your illness." Hearing Mrs. Tessa's lament, James raised his face and said, "I also saw those fortune tellers in the next village. They only told fortunes and horoscopes for a few years, and they built a huge mansion. I've told you so many times, but you still don't listen. If you knew how to do business, 10 mansions would be nothing. I'm a capable person," Mrs. Tessa stammered. "It's a serious sin to sell gods and Buddhas, my child, so I don't dare." But James tried his best to convince her. Whether it's a sin or not is not known, but with poverty and illness, there's no way to cure it without money. It's a waste of God's blessings if you don't know how to use them. Mrs. Tessa sighed. "But your time is almost up. I can feel it clearly these past few months." Hearing this, James widened his eyes and looked at Mrs. Tessa. "Damn! So your fortune-telling and soul-calling ability is really about to run out? This can't be good, miss." This is Mrs. Tessa's secret that only James knows. After being struck by lightning decades ago, every night, Mrs. Tessa dreamed of a man in official uniform, holding a lotus flower, emitting a golden halo. He urged Mrs. Tessa to open the shrine and said that he would open Mrs. Tessa's eyes. After 9 years, she would live a normal life like everyone else. It has been 8 years now, only 1 year left until the blessing from heaven runs out, but she still has nothing in her hands. Her husband, Mr. Corey, is getting worse and worse, requiring a lot of money for treatment. Recently, her psychic ability has decreased significantly. Out of 10 people who come, she can only see 1 or 2 people. After hearing the story, James seemed extremely worried. He picked up the cup of tea that was on the table, drank it all in one gulp, then turned back to discuss something with Mrs. Tessa. I don't know what the two of them were talking about, but I only saw Mrs. Tessa nodding her head repeatedly. While they were engrossed in their conversation, the window in the house suddenly opened wide, and a cold wind from outside rushed straight into where Tessa and James were standing. 2 ridiculous lines of poetry rang out from the gate. Psychic looks in the mirror, monk combs tea, fish turns into dragons. Tessa's eyes widened as soon as the 2 lines ended. Looking at her, James understood immediately and said, "Oh my, you don't need to pay attention. Recently, a crazy girl has wandered into our village and she keeps saying these nonsense sentences, so just leave her alone." The following days, James was extremely busy. He set up 3 or 4 tea stalls scattered from the beginning of the village to the entrance of Mrs. Tessa's house. He said that Mrs. Tessa loved the people who came to line up to wait their turn, so she set up free tea stalls for everyone. Everyone who heard about it nodded in admiration. Surely there was no teacher in this world like Mrs. Tessa. She was talented, kind, and compassionate. While James was very busy with work outside, Mrs. Tessa announced that the temple would be closed for 3 days due to health reasons. A month later, Mrs. Tessa's fortune-telling business was getting better and better. For some reason, she herself confirmed that her fortune-telling ability was not as good as before. But more and more people came, one group after another. Everyone praised her for being good, knowing everything, and predicting everything accurately. The only thing was that Mrs. Tessa was now more selective in her fortune-telling. She would only choose 5 people a day to have her fortune-telling done, and those 5 people were personally selected by her, not waiting in line like before. Every time she did a fortune-telling, she also asked for a specific amount of money, not just a few dozen or 100,000. James quickly went into the temple where Mrs. Tessa was sitting, and he made a list of 20 people who wanted to have their fortunes told and call spirits. Mrs. Tessa took the blue book and looked through it. James said, "Tessa, today I will only tell these 5 people. 3 are from the neighboring district, 2 are from our district." After saying that, he pointed to the names of the 5 people marked with stars in the book. Next to it was a long list of notes that were all different, in which were recorded family histories, current problems, and even the secrets of the homeowner were recorded very carefully. Mrs. Tessa was struggling to read each line to try to remember them, when James gently put his mouth close to her ear. "These 5 people are all very rich. You can talk enthusiastically. Calling spirits will cost 10 million. Fortune-telling will cost 5 million. But if you can get Tessa's offerings, that would be even better. In no time, we will be very rich. Now that your luck is almost gone, use whatever little you have left. Don't worry, the 4 or 5 coffee shops are working very effectively. They sit outside and can get a lot of information from the customers. You can judge freely." Hearing James speak, Mrs. Tessa seemed to have Tessa's motivation. She nodded and smiled with satisfaction. In the yard, people were standing, sitting and lining up, waiting for Mrs. Tessa to call someone's name. Everyone had a worried, absent-minded look on their faces. James pushed the door open and stepped outside. Dozens of eyes were focused on him. He coughed lightly and read clearly, "Please invite Mrs. Tran Ti Moi inside." As soon as he finished speaking, a woman quickly stood up from under the crowd of people sitting around waiting. She was wearing a pure white silk dress, a huge pearl necklace around her neck, and a leather bag. She gently turned and walked forward. Following James's instructions, Mrs. Anna was led to the altars in the temple to place offerings and pray for a while before being led into the main temple where Mrs. Tessa was waiting. The woman named Moi knelt down on the ground and clasped her hands in prayer before Mrs. Tessa. "Namo Amitabha Buddha. I greet you, teacher." After saying hello, Mrs. Anna looked up at the teacher in front of her. Mrs. Anna was a middle-aged woman with a face that was 7 parts kind, but her skin was covered with red birthmarks shaped like lightning from the day she was struck by lightning. Until now, those marks have never faded, and on windy days, they become more and more prominent. Mrs. Tessa had sought treatment many times but to no avail, so she had to live with it. Clearing her throat, Mrs. Tessa spoke. "Who did you come here with today?" Mrs. Anna replied, "Master, I came here alone today." Immediately, Mrs. Tessa raised her voice. "Alone, there's a male spirit standing outside the door waiting. Your house has been harassed by that male spirit a lot lately, right?" Hearing the master's words, Mrs. Anna was startled and reflexively turned to look at the door, then quickly prayed, her face full of panic. "Still, is that person standing outside the door?" Mrs. Anna reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo, then gently raised her hands to offer it. Mrs. Tessa took the photo and looked at it. It showed a man in his 40s, with fair skin and freckles. He was wearing a green shirt and a pith helmet. The photo had been taken a long time ago and had not been properly preserved, so it had been eroded by time, so there were several large mold stains covering his eyes. Mrs. Anna flusteredly explained, "Yes, sir, this is your son's husband. You know astronomy above and geography below. Save me or I'll die." Seeing Mrs. Anna's expression, Mrs. Tessa was pleased in her heart. With that kind of mentality, being led around by the nose was very easy, Mrs. Tessa stood up, lit an incense stick on the altar, then shouted in a powerful voice, "The male spirit is over there. I allow you to come in here. If you have any grievances, tell me. Absolutely, do not harm this woman." Saying that, Mrs. Tessa covered her face with a red cloth embroidered with flowers, wiped her eyes, and shivered very quickly. Then Mrs. Tessa suddenly changed her voice to a hoarse voice, like a man. "You bitch! Why do you dare to curse me, not letting me escape? I hate you! I will kill you!" Mrs. Anna cried and begged. "Oh my God, sir! I beg you, please forgive me. I know I was wrong. Now tell me what you need. I will burn down your house and car so you can be happy in the afterlife. Don't haunt me anymore. I've suffered so much, sir." Looking through the red cloth, seeing Mrs. Anna's face pale and bloodless, Mrs. Tessa smiled happily and continued, "Hey, now that you're here, you have to ask Miss Tessa to remove the spell on me so I can go to heaven. Then I will forgive you. No matter how much money you spend, you have to do it. Otherwise, you won't be able to live in peace." Having finished speaking, Mrs. Tessa took off her veil, shivered, changed her tone to normal, and blamed her sister. "So evil. My husband died, and you brought him back to cast a spell on his grave. Now he can't be liberated. His resentment has accumulated, so it's understandable that he came to torment me." Hearing Mrs. Tessa speak, Mrs. Anna was deeply impressed. She bitterly explained, "Dear teacher, I got married at 18. After many years of hard work and suffering, we had 4 children. Now our family business is quite prosperous. Before, we were poor, and my husband and I lived in harmony. But since he had money, he started to flirt with women. I hated him so much that when he died, I did such a thing, thinking it was just to calm my anger. But who would have thought that now every night he comes back to take me away?" "But why are you so hesitant?" Mrs. Tessa asked. "Yes, no, it's nothing, teacher. I just hope you can help me. If I can't solve this problem, I'm afraid I'll die before my time." Mrs. Tessa smacked her lips and continued, "I can handle this, don't worry. Now, your family must hold a big ceremony at the grave, remove the spell that was cast. Then you can rest in peace, and your descendants won't have to bear the karma. After this is done, your family will even prosper and become even richer. But the person who cast the spell is too skilled. The cost to remove it will be no less than 100 million. I can only tell you that much. As for the ceremony, you can ask someone else to do it. Otherwise, someone with a holy blessing like me will be accused of taking people's money." After saying that, Mrs. Tessa's sharp eyes examined the intentions of the rich woman who was kneeling below. Mrs. Anna quickly opened her bag, took out a stack of money, and offered it with both hands. "Yes, sir. Money is not important. Just try your best to help me. Please accept this 50 million first. When I'm done, I will pay the rest and give Tessa to you." After saying that, Mrs. Anna secretly glanced at the fortune teller. Seeing the stack of 50 million green money placed right on the table, Mrs. Tessa's eyes lit up, and she was extremely happy. Understanding the psychology of the person who came to see the fortune teller, Mrs. Tessa deliberately refused to accept the money. Mrs. Anna had to beg and plead a lot before Mrs. Tessa nodded in agreement. The fortune-telling session was considered a success. Mrs. Anna dusted her butt and stood up when she suddenly had a seizure. Her head tilted to one side, her limbs twitched, her mouth mumbled incomprehensible words. Seeing Mrs. Anna like that, Mrs. Tessa unconsciously stepped back, her face as pale as a banana leaf. James had been witnessing the whole thing from the beginning until now. Seeing Mrs. Anna's strange behavior, he ran to hug Mrs. Anna because he thought Mrs. Anna was sick of something. Suddenly, a "ah" sound came from Mrs. Anna's throat, making James speechless. "Get your hands off me! Let me go!" Mrs. Anna's eyes were hazy. Drool was dripping from the corner of her mouth. Occasionally, she slapped her thigh and screamed. The scene in the palace was truly chaotic. Mrs. Anna stayed like that for about 5 minutes before returning to normal. Only then did Mrs. Tessa dare to breathe in and let Mrs. Anna go away. Mrs. Tessa counted the stack of money in her hand and took out 5 bills and gave them to James as a reward. Suddenly, James asked, "Today's spirit possession was very good, miss. That rich lady's face was pale and she believed everything. But how did you make her look like she was possessed by a spirit?" Hearing her disciple, Mrs. Tessa burst out laughing. "To tell you the truth, no spirit possessed her. She was just pretending. Just now, I noticed that the old lady was wearing an amulet to ward off evil spirits, so I guessed that she was being teased by a spirit, but it turned out to be true." While she was excited, Mrs. Tessa suddenly stopped smiling. Her face looked pensive and said, "As for the matter of her being possessed by a spirit, I don't know either, but never mind. Why think too much? Just worry about preparing the offering to get the remaining 50 million. But you're really bad at worshipping." James laughed and said, "Oh my gosh, that's easy. You just need to read the name of the homeowner and the address correctly, and you can read anything else. No one will understand. Just search the internet and you'll find everything. You don't have to worry." Mrs. Tessa did exactly as James told her. The next evening, Mrs. Tessa went to the cemetery, put on a yellow shirt embroidered with dragons and phoenixes, and stood in front of Mrs. Anna's husband's grave. Mrs. Tessa prostrated herself professionally, and after chanting the spell like the wind and tossing a coin, she ordered Mrs. Anna's family to dig deep into a corner of the grave. But somehow, Mrs. Anna's family dug up the entire grave, and only after a long time did they manage to dig up a piece of bone that was a dull red color. When they saw the bone, the whole family kowtowed and bowed, admiring Mrs. Tessa's talent. Finally, Mrs. Tessa had someone burn the bone. After finishing, Mrs. Anna happily handed over the remaining 50 million and also gave Tessa a big tip. Mrs. Tessa looked at the pile of money and felt happy but pretended not to care and gave the money to James to keep. The victim did not know that James had secretly hidden the dog bone under Mrs. Anna's husband's grave. As soon as she returned home, Mrs. Tessa went into the shrine to count the money earned from that deal, which was almost 100 million VND. At this rate, in just 1 year, she would earn billions. No joke. Suddenly, Mrs. Tessa felt regretful that all her years of working only earned a few coins, not enough to live on. She just sat in the shrine, feeling regretful. A moment later, Mrs. Tessa sat up, intending to go to sleep, when suddenly the candles on the altar went out, the light bulb flickered and then went out. Mrs. Tessa sighed and went down to the kitchen to get the flashlight on top of the refrigerator. Just as she stepped out into the yard, where dozens of people stood guard every day, a strange wind suddenly blew over Mrs. Tessa, making her skin crawl. Then, a woman's voice echoed from the alley. "Ridiculous! Psychic looking in the mirror, monk brushing tea, fish turning into dragon," accompanied by a shrill laugh that seemed to pierce her ears, making the conch on Mrs. Tessa's hand shake. This was not the first time Mrs. Tessa had heard this saying, but she had never seen the face of the speaker, only heard James say that he was a madman who could not control his curiosity. Mrs. Tessa's eyes turned towards the gate. Suddenly the sound of the wooden gate of her house rang. She looked out onto the street. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. Before Mrs. Tessa's eyes was a strangely dark space. The only thing that could illuminate the scene at this time was the weak yellow moonlight. She looked around, trying to find the mad woman of Douai village. Once again, the poem echoed in a shrill voice. The thing that goes first, the person glides behind. From the crack of the gate, the back of a woman wearing a pure white outfit with long, loose hair appeared. That person was reciting poetry while gliding lightly, occasionally laughing shrilly. Right behind was the ghost of Mr. Tai. Seeing that scene, Mrs. Tessa's hands and feet gripped the wall tightly, sweat pouring down like a shower. What the hell is going on? Suddenly, the woman in white stopped abruptly, her figure standing still. Only her neck turned around and made a creaking sound like the hinges of a rusty door. A shout startled Mrs. Tessa. "What are you looking at? What are you looking at?" The strange woman's face suddenly turned from white to red, her cheeks red. At that moment, Mrs. Tessa immediately thought to herself, "Oh no, I've seen a ghost." At the same time, a jet-black owl flew by and cried continuously, "What? What? What?" Mrs. Tessa held her breath and ran straight into the house, finishing the glass of water in her hand. "Mrs. Tessa gasped, her hands trembling. Indeed, ever since the day she started selling gods and saints, her heart had been extremely uneasy. The day before, two couples came to see a fortune teller. She examined them for a while and then said that their ages were not compatible. So for some reason, the couple jumped off the bridge and died. There was also a mother-in-law who came to see a fortune teller. Mrs. Tessa said that her daughter-in-law was pregnant, but the baby's age conflicted with her parents. If the baby was born, the family would go bankrupt. So the mother-in-law came back and forced her daughter-in-law to have an abortion. I heard that the daughter-in-law who had the abortion died of hemorrhage on the operating table. Although it was not intentional, Tessa's words indirectly caused many people to lose their lives. Tessa ignored all of these things. Until today, she didn't know why she met a ghost at the door. At this time, Tessa felt that something was wrong. Tessa climbed into bed to sleep. At that time, her husband Corey was curled up in bed. Corey's illness was also very strange. Out of nowhere, Corey suddenly couldn't walk anymore and was bedridden for several years. His legs were shriveled like two dry branches. Even though he was taken to many places for treatment, his condition did not improve. Unfortunately, not being able to move his legs would lead to many other illnesses. His heart and liver were both sick. All the finances in the house had to rely on Tessa. Thinking about her situation, she could only shake her head to reassure herself and slowly close her eyes. Outside the yard, the wind was still blowing. The owl's occasional squealing sounded like an omen that something bad was about to happen to Tessa's family. In the middle of the night, Mr. Corey and Mrs. Tessa's breathing echoed in the dark night, each with a different tone. Occasionally, Mrs. Tessa would smile lightly as she dreamed of mountains of gold and silver through fortune-telling. While she was having a sweet dream, she suddenly heard someone calling her. "Master, please, please, open the door for me, open the door for me." The call woke Mrs. Tessa up from her sweet dream. She opened her eyes and looked at Mr. Corey. He was still sleeping like before, his chest still rising and falling with his breath. Mrs. Tessa looked around the room. Everything was pitch black. Only a few rays of light from outside the window frame shone in. Mrs. Tessa was angry and cursed a few sentences, then lay down to sleep again. But before she could lie down, someone suddenly grabbed her hair and pulled it repeatedly, causing her to wince in pain and furrow her eyebrows. Mrs. Tessa quickly used both hands to pull her hair that was being pulled. But the more she pulled, the more it was pulled. Knowing that something was wrong, Mrs. Tessa panicked and cried for help. "Oh my God, what is this? Help! Help me!" As soon as she finished speaking, her hair was suddenly freed, as if the person who was pulling her hair had just let go. Holding her painful scalp, Mrs. Tessa turned around to see who it was. At that moment, she discovered that her hair was stuck in the bed frame, and a few broken strands of hair were still stuck there. Although she didn't see anyone, Mrs. Tessa was still afraid, and there was a ghost in her heart that made everything seem dark. Suddenly, Mrs. Tessa thought back during all those years of practicing. All her fortune-telling and soul-calling abilities had come naturally without her having to put in too much effort. Every time she interacted with people from the other world, she felt very calm. But today, it was strange. It made her extremely uneasy. While Mrs. Tessa was lost in thought, a grumpy man's voice continued to echo, as if from the depths of hell. "Open the door for me! Open the door for me!" Mrs. Tessa moved her lips. Who Who is that? Mrs. Tessa trembled, because there was no third person around besides her husband and wife, so whose voice was that? Could it be a devil teasing her? Before she could react, Mr. Corey, who was sleeping right next to Mrs. Tessa, suddenly sat up and crawled to the edge of the bed. He fell to the ground and struggled to crawl to the door. Mr. Corey had been paralyzed for a long time, and at this moment he looked like a crab crawling on the ground. His eyes had turned white, and his tongue was hanging out, drooling. Seeing her paralyzed husband able to crawl, Mrs. Tessa was not happy, but extremely scared. Her face was as pale as a banana leaf. She whispered, "Don't go out there." Tessa's fear soon came true. In just a few minutes, Mr. Corey touched the lock and opened the door. In front of Tessa, right in the middle of the yard, under the pale moonlight, was a man wearing a green shirt and a huge pith helmet. Right behind her was a woman wearing a white dress with long hair, holding a flickering candle. It was not difficult for her to recognize that this woman was the demon she had seen on the street, and the man beside her was the spirit of Anna's husband, who had died a few years ago. Their faces were white, their teeth were long and sharp, their eyes were hazy, as if they had just eaten poison. The man roared, "Who gave you permission to touch our graves?" Then came the female demon's scream, "You give my son back his house. Because of you, my son has no place to sleep. I will kill you." The female demon let her hands hang down, her claws sharp. She dug her nails into her stomach and pulled out a bright red fetus covered in blood and mucus, the umbilical cord of the child still dangling from her hand. "You carry my child. You carry it." Immediately after that, a burst of horrifying laughter rang out. Above Mrs. Tessa's head, the owl was still flying around and screaming. Mrs. Tessa was extremely scared at that time. She was speechless and stood frozen on the spot. Suddenly, the female demon quickly flew close to Mrs. Tessa. It used both hands to strangle her and pressed her against the wall. The sharp nails moved continuously, waiting to pierce straight into Mrs. Tessa's throat. The female demon roared, "You have 3 days to return the house to us, otherwise you will die, Mrs." Tessa panicked and fainted on the spot. The next morning, she woke up in her familiar bed, with James sitting next to her. It was already bright outside. Mrs. Tessa blinked her eyes, signaling for James to help her sit up and lean against the bed. James quickly asked, "Are you okay? What happened last night? When I came to your house this morning, I saw you lying in the yard and my uncle lying on the floor." Mrs. Tessa quietly looked into the distance and then told him the story of last night. James listened and swallowed his saliva. His face was extremely worried because he had stuffed the dog bone there. Suddenly, from outside, a shrill voice and the heavy footsteps of a woman were heard. "Teacher, save me! Teacher!" It was none other than Mrs. Anna's voice. She ran straight to where Mrs. Tessa was lying and stammered, "Teacher, last night my husband came home and wanted to kill me. Save me," Mrs. Anna said, her face as green as a banana leaf, her eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Tessa leaned forward, her eyes bulging. She pointed straight at Mrs. Anna and growled, "That woman, tell me now." Mrs. Anna raised her head and looked straight at Mrs. Tessa, her body trembling as she said, "In the grave, there is not only your husband, but also his lover." The matter was only now clarified. After her husband died of illness, Mrs. Anna murdered his lover and buried him in the same grave. When she killed him, Mrs. Anna also knew clearly that there was a child in her lover's womb, but she still cruelly hired a shaman to curse them so that their souls could not be released. The matter has been going on for 10 years now, but for the past year or so, every night, Mrs. Anna has seen a child crawling to take her life. Fortune tellers everywhere said that the old charm was no longer effective because the person who made it had passed away. Now they had to find a better master to remove the old charm and cast a new one to keep it. And Mrs. Tessa was the one Mrs. Anna chose. After knowing everything, of course Mrs. Tessa immediately refused. It was hard to keep her own life, let alone anyone else's. Mrs. Anna also refused to give up. She jumped up and demanded the money she had given to Mrs. Tessa. The two argued for a long time. No one knew if Mrs. Anna could get her money back or not, but all she knew was that she stormed off. Mrs. Tessa then had to use her own money to rebuild the graves for the man and the woman, but that did not give her peace. Even Mrs. Tessa, sometimes awake and sometimes dreaming, every night she saw a bunch of people waiting in front of her house. One day it was Mrs. Anna's husband, one day it was her lover in white, and the next day it was people who had been unjustly killed because of her judgment. They stood outside waiting for their turn to come in and torture and beat and threaten Mrs. Tessa. In the house of the famous fortune teller, every day you could hear her screaming, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing. Sometimes she would shout, "Long live Vietnam, long live Vietnam," like when she was crazy. As for James, after Tessa went crazy again, he followed someone to Cambodia to do business and was reportedly beaten to death. In Salem now, there is no longer the famous Tessa, but only a crazy woman wandering aimlessly on the side of the road, muttering strange things. This is the end of the story. Thank you all for listening and following. If you have any thoughts and feelings about this story, or have drawn any lessons for yourself from the story, please comment below to let David know. Now, goodbye and see you again. I hope you all have a good night's sleep.